on the very interesting and important theme of, well, if I read it rightly, drawing from the Faure and Delors reports into the future and projecting into the future. And John, you'll explain everything you're going to do, I'm sure.
I will.
I mean, everybody will know who John is. Yes? Anyway, John is a distinguished colleague, UNESCO Professor of Political Economy of Education,
Correct.
in the School of Education, and very pleased to have him. Oh, and Chair of the UNESCO Commission for the UK. Is that right?
Correct, yes.
You see, so I'm well
You've looked
prepared.
me up in who's who.
I did, but unfortunately, well, anyway, yes, unfortunately I forgot, as usual. Anyway, thank you very much, John. Over to you. If anybody is here, I will tell you.
Okay.
Oh yes, there seems to be.
Yes, Gary's.
Gary's.
Hello, Gary. Okay, everyone. Let's begin. Yes, I call this short presentation "Looking Backward to See Ahead," which sounds a bit odd, but there we are. And it's really to suggest that if we look back to the Faure and Delors reports, that it may give us some help in looking ahead to the post-2015 development agenda. Now, first, what is the post-2015 development agenda? What is significant about that date? And what is significant about the date is essentially that the Millennium Development Goals, which were set some years ago, should have been achieved, as I said, by 2015. And it's a question then of what should subsequently, have we achieved those goals, and then a question of what should concern us in terms of the development agenda in the years that follow it, particularly in the immediate decade that will follow post 2015. And the Faure and Delors reports, as I said, are, in my mind, and for reasons that I'll explain further in a moment, seen by people who were involved in setting that agenda, particularly in the United Nations, as being key documents that will help us. Now, the context. Towards the end of 2012, Mrs. Irina Bokova, who is the Director General of UNESCO, invited a senior group of experts in their personal capacity to revisit the Faure report of 1972 and the Delors report of 1996. Please note that the members of this group were invited in their personal capacity, so they do not represent institutions or nations or governments or whatever, but were asked to take part in the group, as I said, because of their knowledge of certain parts of the educational system. And the group is a very international one. It draws from women and men from across the world. It's a small group of about a dozen people, and from different parts of education, both formal, informal and non-formal. I haven't listed the members, but you can find them easily if you wish to know. But the group is co-chaired by Amina Mohammed of Nigeria, who is the advisor to Ban Ki-moon, the Director General of the United, Secretary General, I beg your pardon, of the United Nations, on the post-2015 development agenda. And me, I just said that we are from Nigeria and from the United Kingdom, just by way of information. I should point out that there are, as far as I'm aware, there's only one W.J. Morgan, but there are two Amina Mohammeds in the development field. There is also an Amina Mohammed from Kenya, who is on the board of the World Trade Organization, and these two ladies are very often confused. But the one that co-chairs this particular group is Amina Mohammed of Nigeria, who advises Ban Ki-moon. We were asked to develop a fresh vision for humanistic education in the 21st century, and later in our discussion I hope we can come back to some discussion about what might be meant by that term, humanistic education. And the group's report is expected to be ready for the spring meeting of the Executive Board of UNESCO in 2014. So that's the context. Now, my aim this afternoon is to present the key features of these earlier reports and to suggest some relevance to the post-2015 development agenda. They were important statements of educational purpose, which still have a significant influence on educational policy and practice, giving the need for continuing professional development and for lifelong learning by citizens and on a global scale. However, I've discovered that in discussing with many people now the Faure and Delors reports, that they are better known than read, known of than read, if I might put it that way. And I have insisted or suggested, perhaps is a better word, to the group that we should preface the report that is published in the spring with at least a summary of what it was in the Faure and Delors reports as a guide to a fresh readership. The Faure report, Learning to Be, the World of Education Today and Tomorrow, was the report of the International Commission on the Development of Education, convened by UNESCO in 1971-1972. And it is usually named, as I said, after Edgar Faure, the Commission's chairman, and a former Prime Minister and Minister of Education of France. And the Commission comprised 7 members, again selected, international members, again selected in their personal capacity. I like this document very much. It's a very substantial piece of work. It's written in a very elegant way, which one would expect from Monsieur Faure, and it's very readable still. I have heard some criticisms from the members of the current group that it is too intellectual, too academic in tone and so on. I personally don't find it so, and I think it's written with great clarity and lucidity. And there are copies, as or should be, copies available as PDF versions or as hard copies and so on, should you wish to look at it. Now, the report had a broad objective. This was to identify the new aims to be assigned to education as a result of the rapid changes in knowledge and in societies, the demands of development, the aspirations of the individual, and the overriding need for international understanding and peace. Come in, Simon, please. The overriding need for international understanding and peace. And that final phrase there, the overriding need for international understanding and peace, gives a very strong indication that this was a report commissioned by UNESCO, whose fundamental raison d'etre is to promote through cultural and intellectual exchange, as I said, the conditions for international understanding and peace. Now, Faure argued that lifelong education should be the basis of policies in both developing and developed countries. It did not consider lifelong education as a process of permanent schooling, adult education, or continuous vocational training, but rather as a principle on which the overall organization of the system, and hence the elaboration of each of its parts, are based. And this concept was to be echoed powerfully by the Delors report, which followed. John is a professor of adult education and editor of a journal called Lifelong Education, so he's better placed than me to comment on some of this. But it could be said that the Faure report was the genesis of the concept of lifelong education in a clear, systematic, and sustained way. All right, forgive me, just go back a moment. I would just say that often when we speak of lifelong education, and I did speak about it with someone from OECD only recently, who said, we are still not agreed on a definition of this, he said, and if we haven't agreed on a definition of this after so many decades, perhaps it's not worth pursuing, because, as I said, it is so vague and indeterminate. My response to that was to say, well, I think a very clear definition of this was given, and a working definition of this was given in the report of Edgar Faure, written in 1972 and echoed, as I say, by the Delors report. Now, the Faure report established the concept, as I said, of lifelong learning at a time when traditional education systems were being challenged by focusing on personal development, lifelong education. It put learners, not teachers or educational institutions, at the core of education. And for Faure, the important thing was not the path followed by the learner, but the outcome of the learning process. Now, if you want more details about the Faure report, I put the website So you can click onto that and at your convenience, and you'll have some more information from that site. So for Faure, the important thing was not the path followed by the learner, but the outcome of the learning process. Now in 1991, we move on to the Delors report. The UNESCO General Conference agreed to convene an international commission to reflect on education and learning for the 21st century. And following this decision, the International Commission on Education for the 21st Century was established 2 years later, chaired by Jacques Delors, former president of the European Commission, and a former French Minister of Economics and Finance. Numerous consultations were held around the world. You see that both these reports are very French in orientation, and that's not a pejorative statement at all. They were led by and conducted by, as I said, two very distinguished French public servants, Edgar Faure and Jacques Delors. But this is perhaps again reflected in the style in which the reports were compiled and in which they were eventually written. The difference, I suppose, between them was that in the case of the Delors report, substantial resources were put into this, and it met many times. It had numerous consultations around the world. It was a really major effort, as I said, to consult and to gather data and to present a substantial report. The Faure report was much more limited in terms of resources, but as I said, in my personal view, was equally effective in terms of the quality of the insights that it gave. And this was recognized by Jacques Delors, who said that his report, or the report of his commission, was building upon, as I said, the initial work of Faure. Now the Delors report again proposed a vision of education based on lifelong learning and the 4 pillars of learning, as it was called. And it was not a blueprint for educational reform. It wasn't something that governments could simply take and apply. Because they understood immediately that, you know, economic and cultural conditions in the various parts of the world were so very different that such a blueprint was hardly possible and certainly not advisable. But it was a basis for reflection and debate. It argued that choices about education should be shaped by the kind of society in which we wish to live. And it was anticipating there, of course, that despite cultural and economic differences among nations and societies, we should now be thinking in terms of global communities and living together within a global framework of work. And it is aligned closely with the moral and intellectual principles which underpin UNESCO. We can talk more about those later if you wish. But essentially, UNESCO, when it was set up in 1945, officially in 1946, was set up to create a forum whereby the world could achieve, the countries of the world and the peoples of the world could achieve intellectual cooperation, intellectual support, and towards the common goal of human development and the maintenance of peace. As such, as I said, its analysis and recommendations were more humanistic and less market-driven than other education reform studies of the time. What were the 4 pillars of learning, which I believe, and well, I will submit are the key, features of the Delors report. The first was learning to know. A broad general knowledge with the opportunity to work in depth on a small number of subjects. The second was learning to do, to acquire not only an occupational skill, but also the competence to deal with many situations and to work in teams. Whenever I see that pillar of learning, I'm reminded of my late father, God bless him, who was an engineer by profession, and who taught us when we were growing up how to do things like repair the car and rewire the house and this sort of thing. And when we asked him why he was doing this, he said, "Well, I can see you're going to be intellectuals. I just don't want you to be useless ones. I want you to have the capacity, as I said, to do certain practical things." And this was a key pillar of learning, to acquire not only an occupational skill, but also the competence to deal with practical situations, to be pragmatic and to work in teams. And learning to live together by developing an understanding of other people and an appreciation of interdependence. And by other people is meant not only other individuals, but also other societies, communities, other cultures. And then learning to be, to develop one's personality, and to be able to act with growing autonomy, judgment and personal responsibility to become a mature person. And these 4 pillars of learning have clearly had great influence, as I said, in shaping thinking about educational curriculum and educational development internationally, building upon the Faure report, but then in turn, as I said, projecting ahead internationally. The last was a fundamental theme of the Faure report. While Delors commented that its recommendations are still very relevant for in the 21st century, everyone will need to exercise greater independence and judgment, combined with a stronger sense of personal responsibility for the attainment of common goals. If I might just go back to learning to be, act with growing autonomy, judgment and personal responsibility. Edgar Faure, who I confess I knew relatively little about until recently, but I'm increasingly impressed by him, had the view that the world had for many centuries been an authoritarian world, and he said that an authoritarian world should now be giving way, as I said, to a more democratic world, but also a world, as I said, in which people must act responsibly and with judgment if they were to also have the opportunities and benefit of autonomy and independence. That with independence and autonomy went judgment and responsibility, and that these were not separate things. And this was echoed, as I said, by Jacques Delors in April 1996. Now, the post-2015 agenda, new models for development showing more respect, this is the recommendation of Delors, the connections with Delors, that new models of development should show more respect for nature and for the best use of people's time. That there should be an attempt to measure development beyond economic growth, along the lines of the Human Development Report, which is, again, a document which is available to everyone online through the United Nations. And, I would recommend you to have a look at that. And that economic development should be at the service of the more global development of individuals and of communities, rather than the reverse. That economic development should be for our well-being and benefit, as I said, not for the well-being and benefit of a few people, to which we are simply paid or employed servants. That business enterprise should have an important share of the responsibility for making workplaces open to educational activities aimed at economic growth. And Ki Chi Hing, who has joined us today, so welcome Ki Chi Hing from Hong Kong, who's a member of the ND group in Hong Kong, is actually working on social enterprise as an educational activity, and perhaps say a little bit more about that later.
Yeah, I do a research on the social enterprise. In fact, my research is on how to train social workers to run social enterprise. Social enterprise has taken off in Hong Kong since 2001, and currently the government just investing more money to scale up the whole social entrepreneurship development in Hong Kong. We found that in Hong Kong people are very market-based or very capitalistic, okay, free economy. But in fact, Professor just talking about the Human Development Report. In the Human Development Report in 2011, the Human Development Index, okay. In fact, out of the 169 countries, there is a survey that year talking about whether you have a purposeful life, whether you have a life with a purpose, okay. Hong Kong is very high in terms of very highly developed human development, okay, in terms of the ranking. But in terms of the ranking on that survey, whether you have a life with purpose, Hong Kong is the bottom one out of the 169 countries. Hong Kong, so you can see that Hong Kong is very money driven, okay. but they found very empty in terms of spiritually. Okay, so in a way that was also one of the reasons that we have to think more to learning to be exactly that one, and learning to live together. I think that is one of the way that the Hong Kong government is trying to steer the city, in that direction. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much, Guillaume. We'll come back to that, I think,
Okay.
a little bit later. I'm reminded actually of a remark by another francophone Belgian, actually called Jean Simenon, who in one of his books said that purpose and meaning he left to the weekend. During the week, and that's not such a facetious remark, actually. As he wasn't actually given to facetiousness, so it wasn't such a facetious remark. And learning to be, learning to live with purpose, etc., and having responsibility if one also wishes to claim autonomy. These are very important concepts that came out in the Faure report and then echoed in Delors. But the business enterprise should have an important share of the responsibility for making workplaces open to educational activities aimed at economic growth. So this neither the report excluded the private sector. It didn't say that we're arguing for a public sector world and this is a state socialist program, etc. It didn't argue this. It argued it recognized the existence of mixed economies and the differences in different parts of the world and so on, but still said the business enterprise, and Key has given an example of the social enterprise as a kind of hybrid, should have an important share of the responsibility for making workplaces open to educational activities aimed at economic growth. And it's surprising how relatively new this is and how relatively unsuccessful it is, to actually achieve this. That education and learning must be more than simply preparation for employment. Universities, for instance, we discussed previously, what is the purpose of a university? The great Catholic theologian John Henry Newman wrote this famous book, The Idea of a University as a place of intellectual and moral development, not as a place for the preparation of MBA students or whatever. These were vocational activities that needed to be undertaken, but not in the university system. Well, that debate and possibility is long past us, I fear. We have now universities of the 21st century, but the question is, are they more than simply preparation for employment? Is there more, as I said, that can be offered to both students and staff, reviving the idea of the university as an intellectual and moral community that can also be a beacon for the community in which it sits? Gathering data and this is a very pragmatic function, at national and international level, and the development of indicators which can reveal dysfunctions in education systems. And the UNESCO Global Monitoring Report that no doubt you've heard of has contributed to this aim. Each year the Global Monitoring Report produces an assessment of how far we have achieved the Education for All goals, set under the Millennium Development Goals program. Each year they produce a report which focuses on a theme, such as education and armed conflict, or education and skills development, or education and gender, or whatever. And this series of reports will be coming to, in one sense, will be coming to an end in 2015, but will then renew itself, to a fresh series of global monitoring reports. And again, these may be accessed through the UNESCO website in Paris, to download the PDF copies of this. And then we have Education First. This was a very recent initiative launched in September 2012 by Mr. Ban Ki-moon, and its priorities are to expand access to education, to improve the quality of learning and foster global citizenship. And though ostensibly geared towards achieving the 2015 agenda, as I said, it is inevitable that this initiative will also focus attention on setting post-2015 priorities. And it has three priorities: every child in school, improve the quality of education and foster global citizenship. One of the ambassadors for this program is the former British Prime Minister Gordon Brown, whom I met quite recently actually to discuss Education First and its relationship to the UNESCO programs of Education for All and the Global Monitoring Report. I must say frankly that this remains a very vague initiative. It has very general priorities. It has no really set targets or criteria by which they may, the achievement of them may be judged. It's very strong on publicity, such as putting the Afghan schoolgirl or the Pakistani schoolgirl Malala on the television when she speaks to the United Nations or whatever. But beyond that, I think it really lacks substance and structure. But we can again come back to this. Perhaps there are too many initiatives, if I might put it that way, and it may be better, as I said, to have fewer initiatives and to be more focused and more applied, as I said, in what is being done. Now, in conclusion, because I'm not despite being a Celt, I'm not actually able to see into the future. So I'm not able to say, what is the future, but I want to ask you is whether the significant insights of the Faure and the Delors report that I have sketched out for you, these insights which emphasize that sustainable human and cultural development for the common good is the core purpose of education and learning. So I've set you 4 questions, and there are many others, just for consideration. Is this accepted as a global consensus? Sustainable human and cultural development for the common good is the core purpose of education and of learning. That's what Monsieur Faure and Monsieur Delors both said in their reports. But is this accepted as a global consensus? If so, how may global education initiatives be implemented and sustained to achieve this? Is Education First necessary to stimulate public interest in this? What should be the relative roles of formal, non-formal and informal education? And how have and will things change because of the internet? There are many other questions, and no doubt you can be able to come up with them. But these will give us a starting point. Okay. That's all I want to say at this point, and I just listen now to comments and questions and so on.
Thank you very much, John. We'll open this to the colleagues present.
You pass that to someone. Oh, you've got one? Okay.
Chris.
Can I ask, before we address the questions, John, what the updated version of these reports that you're working on, what you envisage that project is exactly, and what it's going to try to do?
Well, the first thing is that it's not organised on anything like the scale of the Delors report. A number of people have been disappointed at that. They assumed that it was going to be another Delors report. Well, the Delors report took 3 years or whatever, and had many resources. So what it has been asked to do is to prepare itself as an interim report with a view to the possibility of a full-blown Delors 2, as it were, in beyond 2015. So it'll be a short document of about 50 pages. It will have a summary of what is in Faure and Delors, because we were asked to revisit that. It will then look at some of the key issues and principles facing education currently and as far as we can project into the future. It will try to offer some definition of basic terms, such as humanism, lifelong education, and so on, and refresh these in the light of current conditions. And then I have suggested, but I'm waiting for my fellow group members to agree, that there will also be a section which we have tentatively called signposts to the future, as it were, which will be short, succinct statements of about 1,500, 2,000 words, on specific issues, such as early childhood education or literacy, or the teaching of mathematics, or whatever. But because of the time pressures that are on us, and this has been done very, very quickly, the idea is, as I said, to present a document for discussion at the Spring Executive Board in 2014 on that basis, and then to see, is there sufficient, then it will go forward, I beg your pardon, to an international consultation through the national commissions of UNESCO internationally and through the International Teachers, Education International, the Teachers Union, as broad as possible, consultation over a further 12 months. And then in 2015, at the spring or autumn executive boards of UNESCO, a decision will be made whether it is appropriate or worthwhile, as I said, to organise a more detailed report that would something on the scale of Delors. I personally cannot see that but don't quote me on this, please, whatever you do. I cannot see that there will be a Delors 2 on that scale again. And I'm not even sure that it's absolutely necessary to have something like that. Provided, as I said, that consultation does take place. And at the moment, of course, there has not been an opportunity for that wide-ranging consultation. There's been a very focus group within, as I said, the structure of UNESCO. So it'll be a discussion document in short. More than that I can't say.
Can I just ask one supplementary? I could see why there wouldn't be a need to do a Delors 2, because the principles presumably haven't changed,
Yes,
the 4 pillars,
exactly.
for example. You don't need to do that again. So is the purpose of this work to sort of reboot it and draw attention back
Yes.
to those kind of core principles
Essentially, yes.
of what it stood for, just
Essentially,
as
yes.
it ages, as it
Yes, essentially, yes. It's to reconsider. The first instruction we were given was to revisit Faure and Delors and to say, is there what remains from Faure and Delors that is still of value? And we found there's a great deal that is still of value. And also to renew interest in it, Chris, you're right.
Yeah.
And I did say earlier that I discovered that many people knew of the Faure Delors report, but couldn't tell me very much about what actually was in them, and hadn't read the Faure and Delors reports. And we needed to update, modernise third editions, if I might put it that way, but written in a form that will stimulate debate. And this is why I found that I suggested that we adopt this structure of having the signposts, because we were receiving comments from people saying, well, I've read the general statement and you haven't got anything about this and you haven't got anything about that. Well, it could become very cluttered if you started to do that within the main text. But if you had a series of not appendices exactly, but a section where there would be succinct statements by people who were very well informed about particular issues. And that could be of value.
I'm just to explore. I'm the guardian of people who are linking in at a distance, and I have 2 questions here from them. So just to kind of keep them going.
Please do, John.
Tim Loblaw, I think, who's I think somewhere in Canada.
Yes, Manitoba or
somewhere like that. Asks whether the OECD and the World Bank have usurped both reports with respect to global conceptions on lifelong learning.
Say yes, I think so. Right?
He'll hear you say it.
Sorry, Tim. You can hear me. Hello, Tim. Can you hear me?
He won't hear you.
I can't hear him. Okay. Anyway, my very best wishes, Tim. I hope things are going very well with your thesis. Yes, I think you're right. The OECD. Well, I would, yes. On this occasion, I'll go as far as to say I know that you're right. That the OECD and the World Bank have usurped such concepts, and I think the setting up of this particular working group, as I said, by Madame Bakova, is part of her drive to revitalise, modernise UNESCO, and to bring UNESCO back onto the scene as a major player within this. I mean, UNESCO remains the United Nations core agency for education, culture and scientific development. And so its influence, as I said, needs to be exerted much more clearly and much more forcefully. That is Madame Bakova's objective. I know she's told me this, and I fully support her, because I think UNESCO does have this humanistic remit as part of its mandate and so on. It's about building peace. It's about building human development in a sustainable way. It's about global cooperation and so on. Now, we're not going to abolish the World Bank or the OECD, and I don't think we should do. I mean, they're very effective organizations considering what they are charged to do. But they shouldn't be the only voices, as I said, that are here in this global debate. I hope that answers the question.
Yes, it does. He doesn't say so. He just says Calgary, but I think that's an answer to an earlier question. Ellen Buren from Edinburgh asks, what about your opinion on the current way in which benchmarks are measured?
My personal opinion.
Yes. Well, I guess.
Well, okay. Benchmarks. There is someone within the group from Korea, actually, which is perhaps appropriate, who is very keen on dealing with this particular issue, and will write something in one of the signposts in the report. Benchmarks are useful guides, but they shouldn't, in my view, be the mainspring of activity or the mainspring of policy making and so on. I think what we should be doing is deciding what we are trying to achieve in terms of what kind of society we are trying to build, we are trying to develop. Build is not quite the right word, because build has got a kind of connotation of putting something solid and concrete that can't be changed or whatever, but how we can have a society that evolves, if I might put it this way, but in a way that sustains humankind and the environment in which humankind lives. The narrow use of benchmarks, I think, can be very dangerous, because it can lead governments and states and whatever to set what are really quite inappropriate priorities in terms of the longer term vision of the future. I don't know if that's any help to you. I would recommend actually a book edited by a woman called Marilyn Strathern, called The Audit Society. It was published several years ago now, but its arguments are still very pertinent. She did, or the contributors to that book did, analyze a series of case studies of different types of use of audit in public life, and to show in which how the system was driving the individual rather than the other way around, as a consequence of this. But this is just a personal opinion. It's not something that will necessarily come into the report.
Thanks, John. Let's open it here now.
Could I just take you back to my first question? Is this accepted as a global consensus or not?
I think I'd want to come in on that.
Please do.
I mean, one of the things that struck me was the contrast between Delors and Faure, and the shift in thinking which had taken place over that time, and the shift in the language which took place. And that there's a very famous, well, I mean, in my territory anyway, it's a well-known critique of the Delors report, which really describes the sort of the perspectives taken by Delors as being a kind of evisceration, in a sense, of the Faure report, in terms of the way that Faure talks about aims like the need to educate for solidarity, the need to educate for democracy, and so on. These really disappear as concepts from Delors, if I remember it rightly. So I just wonder whether, and clearly that there is that you can find in the EU white paper of 1995, which I guess also tends to reflect sort of Delors thinking. It begins with saying, the aims of education are all agreed across the world now. Well, I mean, it seems to me bonkers to say that the aims of education are all agreed across the world.
So your answer to question one is bonkers, then, is it?
Yeah, well, if I would put it a little bit more succinct.
No,
less succinctly
I
than
do
that.
agree with you that that the Delors report was compared to the Faure report was how may I put it? Well, Jacques Delors was who he was. I mean, who he is. I mean, it was a public policy document written by one of the chief bureaucrats in the French government and in the European government and so on.
It was French.
And it was, but on the other hand, Eric Faure was French, but he was a sophisticated man who wrote with great clarity and lucidity. And I think this is one difference, I think, between the two reports. That if you read the Faure report, it reads as a very thoughtful document. It's written, in a way that treats people as adults and says these people are intelligent enough and well educated enough to understand what I'm trying to say in this report. And it's a very thoughtful and dare I say even philosophical document. And the Delors report was has quite a lot. I agree, John, of sort of Euro speak in it. The words of evisceration, etc. Would come in, and there's a lot of that in it, jargon and Euro speak in it, which you don't find in the Faure report. And I had this discussion with the Assistant Director General for Education, Mr. Tang, from Beijing originally. And he said, "Oh, I much prefer the Delors report." He said, because it sets in bullet points, the arguments and so on. And he says, and I really couldn't get on with the Faure report. I had to say, well, I'm the other way around. I'm afraid. I enjoyed reading the Faure report, and I thought I could go back to it and learn something from it almost each time I read it. Whereas I can summarize the Delors report very, very easily because of the bullet point technique. But there we are.
But I think my point is a little bit broader than just the
style,
the language and style,
okay.
and even the philosophical attitude,
yeah.
All of which I agree with you about. But it seems to me that in Faure there is a broader conception of education,
well, sure.
which is not reflected in Delors,
you're correct.
and yet even so, Delors is broader than some of the conceptions. Take up the Tim's point from the World Bank and the OECD.
Indeed, and the Faure report. This is why I ventured to use the word philosophical about the Delors report. It's a very thoughtful document. And unfortunately, as I said, it didn't have the impact of the subsequent Delors report, perhaps because of the sheer scale and publicity that surrounded the Delors report. But John says that it is not accepted as a global consensus, but it's bonkers to say that. I mean, what do the rest of you think?
This is known as quoting out of context.
Sorry, this gentleman, I forget your name, I'm sorry.
It's Patience.
Passion. What do you think? Is it a global consensus? Or not?
To me, it sounds more theoretical than practical.
Aspirational,
Yes,
perhaps, yes.
Because I come from an African context where quite a lot is viewed academically than practically. My country of origin is Zimbabwe, and we started off after independence with all the resources, but there was a lot of political interference to it and to implementing a lot of most of these policies. And I think it's a pattern really in the context where I come from. When I look at it in the European context, some of it is working, but I heard you talking about the market forces, where sometimes the humanistic nature of education can be overshadowed by targets and
Yes.
processes.
What do you think? What's your name, sorry?
Yeah, Abir. I'm from Saudi Arabia.
Right.
So we still struggling to set out, some goals relating to education, because in 2010 we changed the whole education system, and even we come up with new goal because we want people to be more tolerant and that. But I think we cannot say that this is, include all people. But I do agree that education comes first, because education is the backbone of every society. And if you want to not to implement something or change the society. It's through education.
But is that, you see, forgive me, but no one's yet, apart from John, has yet answered this question of, according to Faure and Delors, sustainable human and cultural development for the common good is the core purpose of education and of learning. Now I've asked the question, is this accepted as a global consensus?
Seems obviously not.
That's why I asked.
Whether it's around the is, isn't it? Whether it should be is, you know, is,
That's the second part, isn't it?
It is because it patently isn't accepted that this is what it's for, isn't it? As we've heard, and we can see in this country that education isn't about the common good and cultural development for the common good. A lot of those aims have been completely abandoned. You might say that, in some extent, in the UK after the Second World War, there were certain educational aims to rebuild society and cultural good, but they've long since been given way to economic aims for education system. But as what is, whether for most people that's not what they think it should be, I think. And they ask about education, and maybe when you divide between schooling or different elements of education, you took education as a whole, as a concept, a philosophical concept, what should it be for? But what do people want their kids to get out of school or out of university? They want them to get exams and jobs and career paths, don't they?
Well, I've just taken you back to the 4 pillars of learning. You know, that this common consensus is in Saudi Arabia or in Zimbabwe or in England or whatever, in Hong Kong. Should then these 4 pillars of learning guide and set out our educational aims? Should we be saying we want young people, and people everywhere, not young people, people of all ages, to have the opportunity to develop themselves according to these 4 pillars? And if we're failing in all of them or some of them, how do we change that? And I think that what I'm saying is that I understood from Madame Bakova that to have this discussion document was to re-energize the debate. And I haven't dared to say to her I thought Ban Ki-moon's education first is more about razzle-dazzle than about thinking and substance and so on. And to consult, as I said, but there are many, as we know, Saudi Arabia, Zimbabwe, England, Germany, Brazil, these are very different places. But can we nevertheless identify some common aims, some common approaches, because we are a common humanity? You know, despite cultural differences, one thing we do have in common is that we're all part of humanity and of the human species, and we have a responsibility, as I said, to each other to sustain that, and we have a responsibility to the environment and the world in which we live, you know, and to other species, you know, within the world. And that could be taken in a religious way, if you like, as well as in a secular or humanistic way.
So that view, John, is partly dependent upon a view that everyone else views humanity in the same way.
Of course.
And looking at what's there, one of the things that I don't think is necessarily, for want of a better expression, spelt out is probably around kind of peace or conflict resolution education. And maybe there's a need to even peel this back further to some essential basics, if you like,
Okay.
that actually allow for these pillars of learning to then become operable and to start influencing.
I think, doesn't Delors say that learning to live together is actually the foundational principle?
I take that,
which
but
in
I
a
think
sense
does it need
is,
spelling out more?
yeah, if you set them all like that, but if you say that the foundation is learning to live together, you build learning to know, to do and to be on the whole platform of living together, don't you, which is the basic.
This is why we've suggested this. I hope it'll work. Anyway, we'll try it. The signpost idea that you might have a specific signpost, which will take a case study, say, Holocaust education would be an example, in which you look at a specific study and to say this is a case study of how we must learn to live together, because the consequences of not doing so are really totally unacceptable. But you have to set it out. And to renew public debate about this, that this is not, in my view, or should not be anyway, a matter for politicians and public servants. I mean, this is a matter for everyone engaged in education, you know, because we all live in society. We haven't got to be engaged in education professionally, as I said, you know, to engage in this debate. And I think OECD, World Bank are experts, certainly, but there's a danger if you put yourself into the hands of experts too frequently. And I think, but the public needs to inform itself. And this is again why I'm indicating my preference for Eric Faure's report. But I think the Faure report does treat people as adults. It doesn't treat them as consumers or as children or whatever, who have to be spoken to in simple language, you know, and whatever. And I think that's really very important. But getting the public debate about the 4 pillars of learning and the nuances of the 4 pillars of learning, I think is a key role for UNESCO, but it is also a key role, as I said, within individual countries and so on. And UNESCO can perhaps show the way in that regard. Simon?
Thinking about UNESCO, thinking about the idea of how global the consensus goes, I think one aspect that UNESCO sometimes is not really good in pursuing is once these 4 Delors reports are there, they're never sent back to national country and ask them to come out with their own view and their own debates. And that's how the missing link between this general and broad tool, which is the Delors report, to what actually means for those countries. And another point, maybe, why it doesn't come the similar report coming from Africa, Asia, or Brazil, India? Why they don't actually have this, I can't say interest, but projection to produce those reports and send them out?
Well, they do, of course, Simon. So please don't misunderstand me in that because these 2 major reports were chaired by 2 prominent Frenchmen, you know, Faure and Delors. They obviously had a very heavy influence on this. It's a very francophone document in its intellectual approach in that way. But the current group is co-chaired by a woman from Africa and myself from the Celtic Fringe. But you're right in the sense that, and this is what I hope will now happen after spring 2014, that this modest document, when it's prepared, will not be, you know, clarion to the world as, you know, the panacea has arrived, the trumpets blow. But will simply be saying, may we remind you of the important elements of the Faure Delors reports. May we set you some questions for consideration that can be then discussed in consultations internationally. And then we can come back and devise some way of perhaps measuring progress in this way. And then you could see, I mean, you know Tunisia very well because your thesis is on Tunisia. To what extent does this apply in contemporary Tunisia or in your home of contemporary Italy and so on? Do people know about these things? Do the education policy makers in these countries think in these terms, or are they simply thinking in terms of how many students can we put, you know, process through a bureaucratic system and so on? Sorry, Chris.
I just wanted to speak up for the Delors report, really. Although you might say the Faure report is a better report to read, fuller, thicker, and so on. What strikes me about the Delors report and the 4 pillars is that the 4 pillars don't just raise questions, but they give you a framework for evaluation as well.
They do.
And so that actually, to me, that does move the debate on a bit, because you can think about those 4 pillars and have used them in this way to think about initiatives that come through, educational initiatives in a country, and then to think, well, to what extent is this about learning to know, to be,
Sure.
you know, to work together and to live together and so on. And of course, you then find that the system is very much focused not on learning to be or learning to live together, but learning to know and learning to do. In our case, and that to me gives you the fact that it offers a simple but actually very profound evaluation framework for thinking about what is actually the existing education system, to me gives you the basis for critique,
It does, yeah.
rather than simply opening up the question, well, can we all agree? Because then the answer is usually almost always going to be no. But what is it we're doing? What is it we're missing? And where are we actually teaching children how to be, how to live together in the system, rather than simply to acquire more knowledge or whatever it might be?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I'm just expressing an old-fashioned preference for the style in which the Faure report was written. But don't take that to mean, right, that the Delors report was immensely important. We know this, and it built, you know, as Jacques Delors himself says, you know, quite recently, you know, the Faure report provided the stimulus, the thinking, the philosophy, or whatever, and that the Delors report then honed that down into a digestible form, if I might put it this way, for a much greater, a much wider consumption.
It's not just digestible; it's also usable.
Usable is
to
a
move
better-
it on to the next phase,
Usable
which I
is a
think is
better
quite important.
Yeah. And what we're trying to
It's
do
got
now in
importance
this
there.
next stage is to try and, you know, not to rewrite these things, but to move on to the next stage and just say, can we make it succinct? Again, don't quote me on this, please, but I do find a great struggle with some of my francophone colleagues about writing things in a succinct and lucid way. They do like very often to spread out whatever. And I do point back to Eric Faure and say, look, if he can do it, everyone else can do it. But it's got to be a document that is usable. Yeah, that's a good word, Chris, because it's a document that's got to be usable by a population as a whole, and not just by a public policy elite, you know, within whatever country we're talking about. Public policy elites, you know, in my view, have dictated ways and means of all sorts of things in life, you know, for far too long. And this is something, as I said, that needs to be challenged, but in an informed way. Sorry, what about our friends elsewhere?
Yeah, well, Tim has come back with another question asking, so far as global consensus goes, does part of the challenge for reaching consensus emerge from an emphasis on formal education alone? We have very thoughtful PhD students.
We do, yes. Emphasis on formal education. I think, you know, again, OECD in particular would very much like to see uniformity in formal education systems. World Bank would be probably like to see the same sort of thing. I've had in UNESCO, I mean, I have some people in the education sector who are talking about this, but in my view, diversity of educational systems is really very important. They have to reflect local cultures, they have to respect local conditions and so on. And to try and have a kind of to force everybody into a one-size-fits-all sort of system, I mean, would be a mistake. And I also think, this is another question we're going on to, Tim, is what should be the relative roles of formal, non-formal and informal education? Christine mentioned a moment ago about educating children to learn to be and to do and whatever, but it's not just that, is it really? We're all capable of benefiting from education at all stages of our life. That's what lifelong education should perhaps be about. Lifelong learning maybe should be about. And so much of education and of learning always has, in my view, taken place in non-formal and informal settings. You know, rather than through the much of what I learned to do and to be and whatever wasn't learned in the classroom at my medieval grammar school. You know, but through daily life.
That accounts for it.
Yeah.
Harry.
Just taking on that point, John, when we've been discussing things, and we were slipping into a language about children and sort of, you were saying young people, there is a way in which this kind of, I can see, nicely operates within those kind of formal educational settings. And I take your point about informal. But I wonder whether within the world of employment, whether there's a need to rethink about the basis of education through employment. And that what we tend to do at the moment in employment in terms of education is kind of continuing professional development that reinforces the employment regime we're in. So if you take bankers, for example, kind of employment, education within employment, education within that sort of job would have a certain basis to it. And I just wonder whether the remit of education within employment basis, a kind of CPD model, has to be broader and more expansive in the way that it thinks about things, and has to become more humanistic.
Yeah. Key, you actually employed people, many people in a company.
Yeah.
Well, how would you answer that question, Gary?
On the employment or the...
Yeah. Just repeat it briefly.
Just that within employment, we ought to have a base of education that's broader rather than just a continuing professional development basis that we have to address within that kind of humanistic basis, and that we don't do that currently.
Yeah.
We tend to have an education that's probably more about training than about education.
I worked in Hewlett Packard before my retirement. Usually when we recruit people from fresh graduate, in fact, it is not so, it doesn't matter much whether they are from engineering or computer history or anything. We are looking for people who have the intellectual capacity to learn, to make decisions. And then when you come into the company, say for example, my former boss is an accountant, my boss is a historian. Okay, none of them is from IT. Okay, but then the company will provide the professional environment to train them, to develop them. Yeah. So that is the view that when we're looking at managing talent.
Yeah. See, Key has just echoed something which I'm 10 years ago I did a report for what was then the Further Education Unit on unemployed graduates in the UK, investigating why people were unemployed. And it was a blip in the whatever, that's by the by. But the question, when you interviewed employers and said, what are you looking for in a graduate and so on, there were some people who said, I want a waste disposal engineer, who was qualified as a waste disposal engineer. But many of them were saying, it didn't matter, theology, philosophy, history, mathematics. There were certain favoured subjects. Mathematics was always very favoured, because people who had creative ability, they had the ability to think, they had intellectual capacity. And they said, we don't want universities going into the business of skills training, they said, because they'll only teach them bad habits that we've got to iron out when they come and work for us. What we want universities to do is to develop them intellectually, and as broadly as possible, and to make them into inquiring people, investigative people, flexible people, team-working people, and so on. And to do that, then when they come and work for us, we will then create the conditions where they can learn what they need to know in order to carry out the job and so on. And because the job is changing so rapidly, something that you learn in 1 year will be out of date in 2 or 3 years' time. You have to be flexible in that way. So we're looking for people with that kind of approach, as I said, rather than someone who says, well, I have a skill. Okay.
The only exception, I want to add more, the only exception is programming. Because the IT industry changes so fast, okay, we cannot catch up in company. So we rely on the university to develop them the latest technology. Other than the programming, then the other is looking for the intellectual.
Universities are about knowledge creation as well, aren't they? Yes, of course. Not just about skills development or intellectual development, but knowledge development as well.
I don't think I disagree with anything that's been said, and sort of recognise that. I think my point was that once people are employed, they have those skills, they're able to think, they're able to perhaps readjust to changing jobs and different things. But where is the basis for them to engage in kind of debate around, for want of a better expression, humanistic issues
Okay.
you face.
Well,
I mean, you can go down the pub and have a conversation
you
with a
can,
friend.
yeah.
You
Whether
can
it's going to be a
newspaper,
very
but, you know,
informed one or not is
well,
another
exactly, and I'm just wondering whether there is a need to conceptualise what education looks like in an employment basis.
If you actually believed what you just said, that if employers really believed that they wanted broad-minded, free-thinking, open-minded people, then you wouldn't sort of arrest that kind of humanistic education once you've got a graduate or once,
for sure.
and then train them on the skills. I see you would have to do that first in order to enable them to do the job. And if the workplace is increasingly a place where real education is going to occur, as was discussed earlier, then surely Gary's point about the need for education in the workplace to take on that broad and to move people on from where they are in that broad.
And you find the very,
philosophical sort of
you know, from
basis.
Hewlett Packard, that it does take place there, doesn't it? Actually, in the really sharp end companies and so on. It does take place there.
Do we think
And of course, the
that's-
other area which is important is the role of Gordon Stewart. Maybe you remember, did his thesis on this topic, you know, which I supervised on the role of professional associations in providing education, continuing professional development, but also broad general education and so on within the the broad field of the professional activity. Teaching about things like professional ethics, for instance, and behaviour in the professions and so on.
Could I pick up on that, John? In order to link it back to the discussion about the contrast between the Faure and Delors reports, and one of the words you used about Delors was, you said it was digestible.
Yeah, I think it's Chris's word of usable is much better.
Well, anyway, whatever. I want to put in a plea for the benefits of indigestion. I mean, it seems to me that one of the
Well,
virtues.
you will if you keep eating bananas at that speed.
It seems to me that one of the virtues of the Faure report is that it actually did encourage debate within, if you like, professional associations, within organisations like the teaching profession, within civil society more broadly. One of the difficulties with the approach of Delors is that it's splendid for bureaucrats because they can digest it down into outcomes and all the rest of it and translate it, but they can do that without engaging with civil society more broadly.
No, I agree
so
entirely.
in your rewriting of Delors and Faure, which I realise you're not doing, but in doing it, I just put down a plea for a little bit of encouraging indigestion.
No, it stimulates you to take something, doesn't it? Actually, if you do get indigestion, that's true. No, but I agree entirely with your assessment of the way in which the two reports are, were constituted and so on. But Chris is right, of course. The Delors report was usable, in a way that readily usable, if I might put it that way.
Not only by bureaucrats.
No, not only.
Other
by
people can use it.
They can.
It's
you're
so
right.
it's not fair to write it off in that way because it's usable.
Yeah.
It's a tool.
It is, and it can be used in many different settings, and, and by teachers and by policy makers and by any kind of professional associations. And many professional, this is an under-researched area actually, the role of professional associations in education and training. And the Delors report and the Faure report, which sits behind it, if I might put it that way, has had a great influence on professional associations as they have shaped, the way in which they construct their CPD programs or their initial professional qualification programs and so on. I'm not saying that it has taken them over, but it has had an influence on them. Now, going back to Tim Loblaw about formal education, my final question on this short list is how have and will things change because of the internet? Which is, the informal education par excellence, as it were. And does this take us back to the 1970s and deschooling, of society? Ivan Illich and my hero Paul Goodman, etc. Well, it's a question, I'm asking. Tim?
I'm not sure he can respond that quickly, but I'm sure.
Okay, well, you will know. Somebody here then, please. Deschooling society, do we need schools anymore? Do we need formal institutions anymore? I know this is heretical talk, perhaps, but still. Or do we need them in quite the same way as we've had them in the past? I mean, the school, in a sense, is a kind of industrial organisation of learning, isn't it? Well, I'm just putting this suggestion. I'm asking a question and not off it. Sorry.
It depends on each generation. My generation, I'm used to sit on a chair and face a tutor.
Yes.
But I think for my children or the coming generation, they are used to go to log on, to get access to the internet, and all the day. So I think they will be addicted to the internet in terms of getting everything from it.
Mm-hmm.
So this year might change the future of education.
Okay. What is the weakness of that, though? I can see the strengths of it. You can look it up on Google. You can say, okay, lifelong education. Look it up in Google, and I'll get 20 million definitions of it or
How
something.
about learning to live together?
And learning to live.
There's a little bit of a weakness of
Well, indeed.
attention.
That's
Learning to be
learning
in front
to
of a
be.
computer.
How to socialize, yeah, that's...
And what about things like judgment, discernment? Sorting out wheat from chaff, as they used to say in the Old Testament. What about that sort of thing?
I think.
How do you do it? I mean, I'm not saying we necessarily have to. Sorry, John, that you necessarily have to do it in schools, right? But how do you do it if you don't do it in schools? The family, that used to be a very important way of doing it, and still is in some societies.
If I can come in on that, I would point to one of the, when you were talking about, and I hate to mention him again, Faure.
Yes.
You referred on one of the slides to him talking about education in terms of outcomes, and I think I can see where that's coming from.
Yeah.
And yet, I think it's not simply about outcomes; it's about educational process.
Yeah.
And I think, I'm also, coming back to Chris, I'm not setting up. I don't want to be seen as setting up Faure as kind of, God and Delors as the devil. It's not like that at all. I mean, they're both on what I would see in the good side of educational policy debates. But one of the features that I think we need, coming back to your internet question, if we are in a world as we are of vastly more easily accessible information, and John mentioned the Faure report, so I thought I'd get it on here, so I've got the Faure report in front of me. If we've got that, one of the things I think we really do need is a very strong fundamentals of education, on which people can build their capacity to interact with different information and sources and so on through the World Wide Web and whatnot.
Let me just say something about Faure and outcomes. I mean, I hope I haven't misled you. I mean, he didn't say actually the only thing that matters are outcomes. What he meant was that there were many different ways of achieving outcomes, and the important thing was to make certain that people eventually had the opportunity for education and that they got that outcome. That's what he meant by it, and there were many different ways of doing this. He wasn't saying, well, unless you get, everyone gets a GCSE or whatever, grade A, in musicology, then we've failed in the music education of that child. He didn't mean that at all. Faure and Delors, far from being God and the devil, as I said, are first cousins, really. I mean, they're very closely related. Delors recognizes this. He says, we've built our report on the insights of Faure's report, and of that particular document. But the question I ask is, can we achieve, will the internet make it ever harder, as I said, to achieve learning to be and learning,
Well, I wanted to say something, because I have to go to a 2 o'clock meeting. I wanted to say something about the importance of institutions like schools and universities in terms of equity, because you're right that learning to be, learning to know, all of those things take place within the family, but family experiences are very inequitable for different people, and schools can, and educational institutions can aspire to be equitable and to try to even things out. And so I think it matters hugely that people do come together in a collective, institutional way, and that behind that institution is the idea that it should be fair and an open opportunity.
And by doing so, so attending this university, for instance, is more than just getting your PhD degree, isn't it? It's about living in a community. It's about living with other people. It's about meeting people from many different backgrounds, and it's about meeting the cleaners. It's about meeting the young woman who serves you your cup of coffee, etc., etc. It's about all of this. It's about living, but in an environment in which you feel protected and safe, I hope, so that you can become confident in being able to do that sort of thing. I wanted to ask Chris a quick question before she leaves, very quickly, and that's about the teacher training program now in the United Kingdom. Someone observed to me the other day, they don't teach people philosophy of education anymore, and they don't teach them about sociology of education, and we don't talk about values in education in the same way that we used to do in, etc., etc., etc.
We talk about values a lot,
yeah,
but the education, the requirement, the way legislation and bureaucracy has made us train people, not educate people to be teachers, is about teachers who do and know. They have a lot of skills, but actually the system is gearing teachers to the successful training to be in that direction, not for teachers themselves to learn to be teachers or live together. If you took those two criteria, and therefore that has an impact on how the teacher works in school. I think the whole focus on learning to be in school. A school for me is a fantastic opportunity for, say, my own subject of English. If you're reading a story, you've actually got 30 people's views of interpreting that. There's a lot you learn from the collective. It's not about 30 individuals, it's about collective experience. But that learning to be and that learning to is what's being squeezed all the time by the legislative process. It's not that people want to do that. You have to squeeze in the bits about the alternative and equity.
So really we're saying is the revisiting of the Faure Delors reports and these 4 pillars of learning.
I think it's hugely important.
It's hugely important.
And I think that the questioner raised the points about the impact of the OECD and the World Bank and World League tables, and how do you rank the education systems by those kind of examination outcomes.
Yes. But that wasn't Faure's objective.
No, I'm saying the danger of having an OECD and a World Bank view as opposed to this. And so I think it's marvellous that it's being kick-started again around these. And I think I wish you every success.
I hope you're not too disappointed by what our modest outcome is. It's only beginning, really, over a very short period. But it is to stimulate this. That's the idea, and it's a modest attempt to stimulate discussion, as this is part of, because I'll be able to feed back to our discussions what I heard, this afternoon, and ask people for further comment and so on. You're welcome to do that at any stage. You've got a copy of the notes. Might I just, before we conclude, John, ask
I
Tim?
have 2 questions here from Tim, if you and Jen has one.
Okay, so Jen first, and then Tim, perhaps.
Well, you looked as if you were about to.
No, okay, Tim then, please.
Tim says, and this isn't you. If you remember, John, you asked him a question.
I did.
I bet you've got what it was. Well, he says, thanks for asking. So he's referring back to your question. He says, as far as the internet goes, I'll suggest it's the trend of awarding badges for achievements that's the problem. It decontextualises knowledge, whereas the Faure and Delors reports are more holistic.
Okay. Great. Except that, I was quite proud to get my school cap for cricket, but still. Thank you, Chris.
Thanks very much.
Yeah.
What was the second question?
Those I put them together.
Okay, very good.
Okay.
Can we?
Yes, I mean, I think we are getting to the end. I think it's been a really interesting session. Is it, I mean, I really hope that this will be Faure and Delors Mark III, if that's the right.
Well,
And even if it's just Mark IIA or whatever,
yeah, sure.
or 2.1 points, that will be worthwhile.
Well, it's a start.
Yes.
I hope it's not been too boring for you. That's the.
And thank you very much, John.
Okay.
And as
Sorry, go on.
no, I mean, I was just going to finish up by saying, as I said at the beginning, what will happen next with regard to seminars in the HAV series?
Well,
Watch this space or some other.
if this is the final seminar in the HAV series, John, it's been my great honour to have delivered it and so on, and I will certainly put it on in my autobiography. It will be a footnote in my autobiography. And on this date,
After Professor Morgan's presentation, it wasn't thought that any more was necessary.
as Shakespeare would said in Hamlet, the rest was silence.
Indeed. Thank you very much for coming. Thank you very much for joining us.
And
Ella
thank you
and Tim.
to the two on who
Yes.
streamed in, especially.
And farewell.
Okay, very good. I have actually did publish a short article with my colleague Ian White, who I fear to say has now left UNESCO to work for the World Bank. And the notes that I presented you today are in a sense a kind of summary version of that article. So I can, it's not a very long article, it's about 3,000 or 4,000 words, something like that. I can certainly let you have copies of that, the PDF copies of it. So if anyone's interested, just send me an email, and then the quickest way of doing it is send me an email, and then I'll return it to you. Okay, it's not obligatory to do this. This is not compulsory education. I mentioned Paul Goodman, who I advise everyone to read, actually, if you have the chance. He wrote a book many years ago called Compulsory Miseducation. He was a teacher of mathematics and English in the Bronx in New York City in the 1960s. Very good. It's bound to be a copy in the library. But, okay, on that note, I'll say thank you very much. Good flight back to Hong Kong, Key. And I'll see you then in January.
Yeah.
Okay, bye-bye then.
Okay, thanks.
You're welcome. You're welcome. I don't know whether you want to distribute these to anyone who didn't come.
I'm afraid they're more used to you than to me.
Well, I just think
One talk.
I just took the list that Janet had sent me years ago.
I don't know how many names.
You know what happens with these things, you know, I think that even nowadays, sort of think, I don't even need a book, I don't need to go to a concept on my assignment, I don't need to go to I mean, modern education is something we didn't get onto it.
One comment on this presentation.
Yeah.
I mean, you said it goes back to this outcome.
Yeah.
You give the impression.
No,
No. I from what you say here, this bit about the before the important thing is not the path followed by the learner, but the outcome, the learning process. Looks as if it comes from the
Yes, it does. No.
And I mean, to me, that could be interpreted as UNESCO trying to, as it were, come closer to the outcome-based education model that is now predominant. And I mean, I just wonder.
No.
I mean, one of the problems is that you know.